My job's really easy. I'm introduced Mike Baird. I mean, everybody knows the New South Wales Treasurer. But the interesting thing for Mike is that obviously he was elected to the New South Wales Parliament in 2007, and I can go through the interesting biography framework. But I've been looking for those unique things, and what always challenges me about a politician is they must regret their maiden speeches, because the first thing you do is go back to a maiden speech, and they could have been in Parliament for 20 years, and they must often think, I wish I'd written this 20 years later, so people can pick it up. But the two interesting things I got out of that have all proven to be very fascinating because of their delivery over time. One is political donations and putting caps around that, which he saw was important. And secondly was the one that I was really intrigued with from a partisan party politician was how do we release the bondages around political party members as local members to be able to have some freewheeling on vote with issues that are very important to their constituency around local issues. So it's a great privilege for us to have you talk at an infrastructure conference, especially one that's supposed to be smart, because obviously there's a relationship between the New South Wales Treasurer and smart infrastructure. It's good to see you here.
Thanks, David. I'm sorry you had to go back and read my maiden speech. That does seem a long time ago as I think about it. And it's interesting because that concept, which isn't related to infrastructure, of freeing up individual members to make a contribution to party, was born very much out of the independent movement. And when I spoke about that, it clearly, the primary vote was falling, and it continues to fall across the spectrum. So capacity to remain local, and I think you saw a good example down in Indy, where a local community felt that they weren't being listened to, and it shows you the peril. So first and foremost, any politician that stands here should understand their local community, and that should be their number one priority. And that really was the key sentiment in relation to that. I haven't had the cause yet to cross the floor, but you never know. Could be issues we could talk about. Thank you, and I thank the Lease for certainly sponsoring the lunch, and I think there's a very illustrious table I'm sitting at over here. It's fantastic to see all types of people that are there. Obviously, the former Premier Nick Greiner. It's great to have him here, and I do talk about him in relation to this presentation going forward. Rod is here, Philip, Ken, and almost Hamish, who I went to school with. First time I've seen him since I was at school. He looks pretty good. He's looking well. Listen, it is a treat to be here, and I do understand this morning that basically the consensus view was that really what is wrong in this space is politicians. So what's the solution? You get a politician to speak at lunchtime. So maybe we need to work on the structure. But listen, I have had very positive feedback, and I do see Graham Bradley as the new infrastructure chair is also here. I just want to lay out a few thoughts I have in this space. And obviously there are many great minds that sit around this room, and I do congratulate Gary in particular for his leadership in this space. And in opposition, you meet many people. And the closer you get to an election, the more interest there is. But Gary was someone that outlined the vision of the university in relation to infrastructure, how important it was, and it is one that I thought was absolutely first class, and it's great to see it going from strength to strength under your leadership, Gary, so well done. So on that basis, it is a privilege to be here, and I do want to outline, in essence, what I say I think is applicable to every state in the country. And ultimately, it's no good just having one state moving. There is a huge challenge across all of them. And what do we do? So for what it's worth, here are some thoughts. The first thing I wanted to highlight is that every state has challenges, and that's not going to be news to you. But ultimately, what are the challenges that stop it? Because really, if we all know the infrastructure needs to be built, why don't we get on and build it? What is the constraints, and how come we're not getting the sort of progress at the speed that we want to see? And there's a few that I can talk about from our perspective, and some of you would have seen part of this before. We inherited what I would call pretty significant fiscal challenges, and this is, and apologies for those that can't quite see these at the wings of the room, but we inherited these, and each state's going to tell a relatively similar position, whether it be the deficit, and I'll talk about infrastructure in New South Wales in a minute, but they identified that our backlog over the next 10 years is about $30 billion. Our net debt profile that we inherited peaked at about $55 billion. And at those levels, you start to impinge right on the metrics for a AAA rating. So obviously we now only have 2 states left with a AAA rating. But I would be strongly arguing before the global financial crisis, you might have a different argument that, well, you don't actually need to have a AAA rating, you can come down. But post the global financial crisis, that's not a spot that I want to be, and I want to have most possible access to capital. And obviously the higher the rating, the more access to capital you do. And if you look at where they got, Western Australia, since they've lost it, I think their debt at a 10-year has gone out almost 30 basis points. So the cost over the next 10 years is going to be pretty significant. And that is something that each state faces. Wherever their rating currently is, a reduction, well, it's a similar sort of impact. This shows the debt profile that we inherited. So this was the trajectory, and not surprisingly, the debt levels get to a point that the AAA is definitely under threat. Effectively, right against the threshold. Right against the threshold was what we inherited. We also inherited an economy that wasn't travelling that well. Indeed, it's amazing to think back. If you think about New South Wales, I think all of us got tired of opening the papers and seeing where we sat on whatever indicator came out. New South Wales seemed to lag the pack on almost everything. And for a considerable period we did. For the previous 10 years, we had the slowest economics growth, the slowest jobs growth. Business confidence was lowest amongst most of our businesses, and housing supplies are lowest. It used to be about 7.5% of the economy, the housing sector. It's fallen. It did fall to about 3%. So it was a huge drop-off, clearly connected into the number of dwelling starts. So that was the broad context. The good news keeps running, and this is very consistent with the other states. And that's the revenue growth. So this is now not just a challenge at a state level, it's obviously at a Commonwealth level quite significantly. But that's a 4-year rolling average you can see, and that trend is where we've come in. So it was running relatively high. Indeed, the decade average is about 5.6% before we got in. So that was 2011 back to 2001. But as you can see, that started to drop off. And in real terms, what that means is we've lost about $2.5 billion a year. So before you put an additional dollar to infrastructure or enhanced services, you've effectively lost $2.5 billion off your bottom line. And you're knowing state governments, I mean, they really operate surpluses or small deficits in the hundreds of millions. We're really in a break-even position, is how I describe that, whether you'll be a couple of $100 million in surplus or a couple of $100 million in deficit. And indeed, from a media context, it thinks is, well, if you've got a $300 million surplus, everything's rosy. Well, if you think about the infrastructure deficit, you think about the debt profile, you're anything but rosy. You're not even paying the interest on that. So that has been a significant challenge, that $2.5 billion that we face, and that is consistent across every state. You've seen significant fall off in this revenue. And the future infrastructure demands, which is part of the Infrastructure New South Wales report, which I'll get to, this shows that there's additional pressures coming. So not where we sit now, but huge pressures that we're seeing across the system. Over the next 20 years, a 20% increase in car trips. Significant movement around port botany and coal freight. So that is going to provide significant infrastructure pressures around those. Obviously, Sydney Airport, that's another topic. That Sydney Airport is moving up in terms of the capacity constraints together with hospitals and housing stock. So all of that is suggesting that as we grow, and it's up to 2 million people over the next 20 years, that is going to put existing pressure on an infrastructure system that's already creaking. And I think that is really the reality. So there's no two ways about it. They're the problems, but how do you move forward? You know, you have to deal with it, and you can't just sort of stick your head in the sand and say, well, that's all too hard, we can't really do anything. Let's be like governments that have gone and come before and just say, well, we really can't make much progress. So you have to come up with the right strategy, and I think that's the important point. But how do you tackle this? And I think that this is a blueprint that would work for any state. The first thing you have to do is actually get an overall structure to your planning and your investment. So you need your you need tiered and long-term planning. And I know there's a number from planning that have been part of this session this morning and will be part of the overall afternoon. Whether it be a metropolitan strategy or a broad state strategy, you need to know where we're going, where we're growing, where we're employing, and what the infrastructure needs are that overlay that overall strategic direction. You then need to get a deep understanding, well, across that, what are the projects that make the most difference? And that's a rigorous selection process, economic rigorous process, as opposed to one that sort of suits a political agenda at election time. Some rigorous project selection. A strategic approach to funding, which I'll get to, so you need to be, I think, quite strategic as you respond it, and that'll ultimately lead to delivery. So all of that approach is common sense. Well, how do you actually start to execute it? Well, you turn to Nick Greiner and you say, Nick, can you fix this? So he did Infrastructure New South Wales together with Paul, did, I think, a fantastic job in finally outlaying the blueprint that the state had craved for many years. So on the back of some of that planning work, you identify and prioritise that critical infrastructure. So we now have a list, which I'll get into in a second, across a range of time frames that the state needs to get on with to catch up on the backlog we've got. It's 20 years, and I think that's important. You can't just think short term, you need to know where we're going long term, because project builds upon project, and certainly the private sector understands that you need to look longer term rather than just short term. And if there's a capacity to link some of that longer term infrastructure earlier, well, they will do it and innovate around it. And then we've got 5-year funded plans. So as part of each budget, there is a funded plan that goes towards it. That is the simple way that we have gone about it. Infrastructure New South Wales have identified it. And they have, in simple terms, created this list. And this list across the private sector is, I think, a significant achievement of the federal government, because governments come and go, and believe it or not, we believe it, we will be thrown out at some point. My hope is that this list remains, and that is what is required for this city and this state, for this list to remain. And you can see some of the projects, over 0 to 5 years. I mean, the WestConnex project is critical. The F3M2, which I'll talk about in the funding side, over the 5 years, rebuilding Wynyard and Town Hall, potentially the FX extension, and the Malden to Dumbarton rail line, which starts to make sense in terms of Wollongong, in particular, as the port starts to increase capacity, particularly as Port Botany reaches capacity. So that gives us an overall time frame, a whole range of priorities, and a systematic way. So economic evaluation of the priorities enables us to move forward. So with that in context and that strategy, together with the planning, you move on to the small matter of funding. Now that's not easy, but I think that there is a very clear way that you can do it. I think what is missing is, from a state government point of view in particular, that there is, if you want to get on and build the infrastructure, you have to be prepared. There's a range of difficult decisions that have to be made across government. And it's about political will, it's about connecting the two. And I don't think enough has been made about actually connecting those two. Controlling your expenditure, which leads to a surplus or a sustainable surplus, well, that actually gives you a capacity to fund infrastructure. I think Rod Ennington said that today's surplus is tomorrow's infrastructure. It was absolutely right, because if you haven't got a surplus and you have to borrow, and if that borrowing's never paid back, well, you're on an unending cycle. So you do have to make some difficult decisions, and certainly here we have started to do that across a range of measures. And I think this is the important slide. You need to have this a fiscal discipline. People ask, and this is obviously not trying to be a political speech, but where did the money go over 20 years when the good times were rolling in? If the former government had just stuck to their budget, there is $20 billion there. So on average, their expense target put out, on average, $1.3 billion higher. Now that is a tragedy in the sense that I think all of us could use $20 billion on a range of measures for the infrastructure today. So the culture, you need to change the culture across government that budgets matter. And I think that's a critical measure. As soon as agencies understand that budgets matter, they're held to account on achieving their budget, you start to have the capacity to actually deliver what you forecast and deliver surpluses, which is ultimately where you need to get to. So on average, we're about $1 billion under in terms of our expense targets for the 3 budgets that we've done. But it's really, the important point is to change a culture. You need this across government. You also see controlling expense growth. So when revenue growth falls, if government doesn't take actions, well, I mean, that leads to structural deficits, and you are a long way from having the capacity to actually meet the infrastructure challenges. You can see that it started to roll down with us. So that's where the revenue line has got, and this is where the expense line has gone with it. And importantly, from rating agencies' point of views, this is their laser-like on this particular point, they go, okay, well, it's one thing to have a forecast, but really, what have you achieved in the last 2 or 3 years? They're looking, the best predictor of historical performance is your past performance. I mean, it's nothing very similar in finance companies and banks. Your clients, they may present projections, but their management team and their track record is what matters. And this is, again, the rolling average. So in 12-13, even though it says underlying expenses down to 4.7, that's rolling. In actual terms, for 12-13, it's down to 2.7. So that is, they then say, okay, well, they've controlled expenditure and there is belief going forward. So my strong belief is we get to a position with expenditure going down. If the economy moves in a stronger context than we anticipate, well, there'll be more capacity for infrastructure, obviously more sustainable surpluses that move forward. We've done the same on debt. Obviously, the improvement in expense management has helped to lower that. But again, debt is not bad. And I think that this is part of the narrative that needs to change across governments. Good debt that goes to productive assets, that helps the overall productive capacity of an economy, is something that is well worthwhile undertaking within the matrix of the credit ratings, within the matrix of your overall fiscal strategy. But obviously, if debt is going towards to breaching your AAA rating, you need to reduce it, which is what we've done. And a big part of that reduction has come through the recycling capital model. And this is one, I think, that is pretty simple. I mean, it's interesting that it's got quite a lot of attention because it's really just common sense. But if you go through all the challenges we've had, really, the only way that you can get on with the infrastructure is to do this. I mean, it's to look at your balance sheet, to take that capital and put it into the next project. And that is something I think we need to see across the country. Whether it be sales or leases, we have set up an infrastructure fund which is very clear, and it's important they are linked, that if we undertake this, so the most recent transaction, Port Botany and Port Kembla, the big part of that was $1.8 billion that goes to WestConnex. So if we do this lease, well, we can put the seed capital in and WestConnex is going to be funded. Up in Newcastle, taking that port to market where we're still in scoping stage, but obviously that is a transaction we're keen to pursue if everything comes clear there. We have said the revitalisation of the city, which has been a long-running project and thought, well, if this lease gets done, then the capital goes into the project. Again, I think part of the government's ability to sell the message that it's an asset for an asset, and as you're seeing in the ports in particular, the assets have involved super funds coming in. So in many respects, I think 1 in 2 Australians are participants in IFM who actually now have the long-term lease of the port. So you still have an ownership in the port, you've got the money up front, you've got the balance sheet shackles taken off a new operator in the port. In many respects, it's a win-win-win at every say. And we saw the same thing in the desalination plant. Obviously, the state's electricity generators is a more difficult sell. It's more. There's obviously more risk that comes with that, but there's also broader economic benefits to come as well. As the government removes itself from the electricity sector, it gives more confidence back to the private sector to invest and provide the new generation rather than the state government. This has improved the credit metrics. The dark blue line is where we sit after the budget. I haven't got a final position on where S&P and Moody's are going to provide us. Obviously, we saw the challenges that WA have had. We went on watch the same time as WA, but our hope is with the actions we've taken together with the recycling, we've maintained the AAA, but at the same time we haven't taken the foot off infrastructure. And that's the balance. It is a balance. And I think that you need the will around the cabinet table to make some of those decisions, which gives us the capacity to do all this, and a broad public message that this is the way we're going to achieve the infrastructure that you want to see. I think that's the important part. So the last part I just want to touch on is the delivery. So you've got the strategy. We've seen the direction and the actions that you've had to take to make it happen. Well, how does it get delivered? And the first project that we've got is the WestConnex, and I think this is a good study. Nick's work in Infrastructure New South Wales across the whole parameter of economics, this was the burning priority that was established for the state. So that is clearly identified as the biggest priority we need to get on with. I won't go through all of it, but a widening of the M4 in terms of going out to 4 lanes, the connection into the City West Link, a tunnel down which connects into the port, and then the widening, the duplication of the M5, and all of that is huge, whether it be a 40-minute trip saving from Parramatta to the airport, 52 lights that go, 3,000 trucks off Parramatta Road. It is a big driver, $12 billion, thousands of jobs. It is an absolutely massive benefit, $12 billion being the economic benefit, a massive driver for this city and this state going forward. Now, what we've done with this, again, from a funding point of view, I think that you have to be adaptive. It's not a cookie cutter approach. And I think that's important for states. You don't want to have a cookie cutter approach. The model that we are pursuing in WestConnex is reasonably simple. It's the government puts in the capital up front. We're putting in $1.8 billion, the Commonwealth and our new friends and partners are putting in $1.5 billion. Well, anyone's my friend for $1.5 billion, I'll tell you. They're putting in one and a half, which provides the capacity to build the first section. And then once that first section is built, the tolls come on. And if there is a benefit, we've said, then we're asking the community to pay for that. And as the tolls come on, that revenue stream can be borrowed against to provide the capital for the next section and so on. So that model kind of flows around. And as you can see, there's a flow of funds that come with that. Interestingly, which is the next section, the anticipation is for future private sector interests. So at the moment, the governments have put in the equity, but as you can see, WestConnex finance there in the middle. There is a potential for super funds or others to take out the state government's equity position, and we can use that money and then go on to put it into additional infrastructure. So there's additional recycling benefits as you go. But at the same time, there's a capacity for super funds to participate in the debt tranche. I mean, there's no reason that they couldn't come in for some of the non-recourse financing once the equity levels are established at the early stages. So you can structure debt across various configurations that make it attractive to super funds. So super funds can participate in the debt, they can participate in the private sector, the equity space, but we think that this model doesn't take all the risk out, clearly, but it provides, in essence, a greenfield asset as opposed to a brownfield asset as opposed to a greenfield asset, which is really what the super funds are looking for. And it is just a concept of getting every bang for your buck, because if you follow it through, the long-term lease of the port, that money goes into the WestConnex, that is built and up and operational, then there's a capacity to release that for further work for the state. Now, it obviously can't go on forever, but that model is something I think that we should be pursuing and pushing as far as possible, because it used to be just a grant given to a road project. Well, this is a capacity to recycle it and keep working for the state. We're clearly supporting the PPP projects. This doesn't include the WestConnex yet, and other projects, doesn't include light rail or even the Northern Beaches Hospital, I don't think. So clearly we're embracing the PPP, and there are different forms of approaches across them, but in simple terms, New South Wales has clearly said that the PPP model is going to be a critical part of the way we deliver. And it's in simple terms, there is a greater capacity, taking every single dollar you have and looking for the exponential connection across all of them, as many projects as obviously you can. And then the last point is the F3M2. I think this is a good example of how the model is starting to work. So if you have the list of priorities established across the whole of government, so here are all the infrastructure priorities across the state. We've said to the private sector, here they are, and at the same time, if you have any ideas on how this might be able to be brought forward, we'll bring it forward. And obviously, Nick, as Chair of Infrastructure New South Wales, was overseeing this, and we ran through what is called the unsolicited proposal model. And that is, I think, working, because that project, which sat lower down on the priority list, The private sector has said, listen, we think we've got something unique we can offer. We can minimise the contribution the state has to provide. Obviously, a Commonwealth contribution helps as well. But if you want to build the the F3M2 project, well, here's a way to do it. And we're obviously proving that up in the final stages now. But again, it's opening yourselves up. And I think that that sort of partnership and innovation comes with a very clearly established priority list and a government that's open to private sector engagement and uniqueness to actually tackle the challenges that we have in infrastructure. So that's really my last point. Well, the last point is this. I think that there is no point having infrastructure, and this is what can get lost in the models and the approach and the discussion, unless we understand that underlying it, we are only interested in infrastructure that's making a difference to people's quality of life. That must be what we're driving. We could have a fantastic piece of infrastructure that delivers nothing for the communities it's supposed to, and that's where we need to make that connection. Whether it be releasing the capital and the projects that that's going to provide in the day-to-day lives, or whether it be the actual physical project itself, making sure it's clearly understood that the pain, the disruption, the overall strategy the government's pursuing, which can involve some relatively tough decisions, we're doing this because this is going to make a difference to your life, your day-to-day commute, or your day-to-day healthcare. Whatever the connection is, that's critical, and we can't lose that as part of the debate. So, listen, I wish you all the best for the conference. I wish you all the best over this afternoon. I think it's incredibly important. I do again pay tribute to the university and Gary's leadership in this space, because there's no doubt that what comes out in the next week is going to help us to achieve what is critical, and that's the right infrastructure, the right place for the right community benefit to get the state moving. So thank you very much.